Hi guys, it's Debbie and welcome to my annual top 10 worst movies of the year video. If you want to see me more positive, check out my channel for my other video on the top 10 best movies of the year. I don't know if 2024 was unfortunately plagued by a series of really bad films or if I was just unlucky enough to watch enough of them, but it got so bad to the point that I started to think that Under Paris, the film about sharks swimming in the sewers of Paris and attacking Olympians, was not that bad. That's how bad it was getting. Of course, later on in the year, many better films were released, luckily. Anyway, as every year, here comes the usual disclaimer. These are mostly big films. I'm sure that if we could find much worse if we were to dig deeper amongst B movies. These were just major releases which were unfortunately also very bad. And before we get into the list, please note that I haven't watched Megalopolis or Borderlands, which I know were heavily criticised. And for the Italians out there, no, I haven't seen Fabbricante di Lacrime, the Tia Smith. I drew a line at that. But stick around to the end of the video because I will also talk about some honourable mentions that didn't quite make it into the final top 10. And now, kicking off at number 10, we have The Idea of You, a film which isn't half as bad as other titles I will speak about later, but one for which I have no idea who the target audience was. In the story, Anne Hathaway's character takes her daughter to a concert of the hottest boy band on the planet. Somehow she ends up casually entering the 20 years younger lead singer's caravan and personal toilet, where they basically fall in love at first sight and start a steamy, unrealistic relationship while the whole world watches. And naturally, her daughter hates her for it. Now, did they think that teenagers would be attracted to this film because they think that a singer will spot them in the crowd at the concert and fall in love with them and bring them backstage and start this relationship with them? Did they think that horny mums would like it because they dream of having the younger toy boy? I think nobody liked it in the end. The dialogues are unbearably cheesy. The outcome of the story is predictable. The sets, costumes, and overall design feel fake. There's probably one quite realistic scene throughout the whole movie when the mum has to go to a pool party with the boyfriend and his very young friends, and she obviously feels a bit awkward. And what I'm even more confused about is that it's not even one of those bad roles big actors take just to pay some bills. Anne Hathaway literally produced this film. It's supposed to be a fairy tale whirlwind romance, something you enjoy while knowing it'll never last, but it ends up feeling just like another Forbidden Desire 50 Shades knockoff, and I'm sure it wouldn't have been just as popular if the roles had been inverted. Next up is Night Swim, a horror film which should have probably stayed as the short film it's based on. It's way more terrifying in its original form. The story revolves around an evil presence in a family's pool, something which could have been easily avoidable by not going in that pool after the first 3, 4, 5 ominous incidents. But no, the family insists on hosting pool parties, swimming at night in it, doing physical therapy in it, playing games, and nearly drowning during Marco Polo just because they refuse to open their eyes and lose the game. Every time something happens, they're absolutely terrified. Next day, they're back in it as if nothing ever happened. The cast of this film is surprisingly strong, featuring Wyatt Russell and Kerry Condon. I actually read a hilarious review about this film which blamed Jamie Lee Curtis's undeserved Oscar win instead of Kerry Condon on this film then being created and her being cast in it. Anyway, but not even a decent cast can save atrocious dialogue, characters withholding vital information, others over-explaining backstories, and the fact that 90% of the jump scares were actually shown in the trailer. I was basically counting them down as they happened. I understand this film was tricky to make with many underwater shots that are a logistical nightmare, but the pool itself constantly changes size. I'm aware that during the haunting scenes the pool appropriately looks huge and dark and inescapable. It's meant to look like that. But in normal scenes, the size just shifts inexplicably. Sometimes it's small enough for someone to walk across doing some physical therapy, then suddenly it's big enough for a large pool party, or so deep they're diving meters down to retrieve something. I don't know what happened, but this movie is produced by James Wan, one of the biggest names in horror. He literally created the Saw, Insidious and Conjuring franchises, and he produced this film with Jason Blumhouse, a studio that had its shares of misses, you know, They, Them, Firestarter, Fantasy Island, The Exorcist Believer, but then also delivered some of the best modern horrors: Get Out, Us, The Black Phone, Sinister, the Invisible Man creep. So somehow something went completely wrong with Night Swim and the concept was lost in execution. Next up is Unfrosted, a film loosely based on the origin story, the creation of Pop-Tarts, which I can proudly say I think I only tasted once in America. I think this film tried to ride the wave of the product origin movie trend we saw from 2022 to early 2024 with films about Air Jordans, BlackBerry phones, Ferrari, Hot Cheetos, Tetris, but not every attempt works out like Barbie. Unfrosted takes this supposedly comedic approach, turning the story into basically a non-stop gag-filled plot. Unfortunately, the humour just doesn't land. There are scenes with Amy Schumer and Jerry Seinfeld that are so exaggerated and so poorly timed that it just feels like the actors are waiting for the fake added audience laughter track. The plot mostly revolves around a rivalry between cereal breakfast food snack companies, nearly aiming for a Wonka and his competitors vibe, but coming off more like, you know what? It honestly reminded me of Timmy Turner's dad when he's angry with his neighbour and like clenches his fists. It's like, Dinkelberg. There's not that much more to say about this film. It's just filled with silly, unfunny jokes, a bit of slapstick, and nothing that adds any genuine curiosity about the story of Pop-Tarts. But is it really a top worst films of the year list without one of Lindsay Lohan's awful new films? This time it's Irish Wish. A film which feels more like a spoof of her work. Actually, you know what? That would have even been funnier. Her taking like a comedic approach. But no, unfortunately this film takes itself very seriously. The plot follows her character travelling to Ireland for her best friend's wedding, where she makes a wish to be the one marrying the guy. Ireland works its magic and poof, she is suddenly living this whole different new life, which by the way makes me think, were they trying to get us nostalgic, ready for the new Freaky Friday remake? The magic sequence, however, looks like it was made with Windows Movie Maker. The effects of this film were horrible. Even setting aside the supernatural element, the entire movie feels off. The dialogue's delivery is atrocious, as if the actors are reading their lines from big cards behind the camera. The outfits and sets are so overly polished and perfect, they look like an advertisement, not a real movie. The acting is wooden, there's no chemistry or genuine emotion, and the ending is so predictable that you basically figure it out within the first 15 minutes of the film. It's not even bad in an Anyone But You style, which again has weddings in the way, in which you actually laugh every now and again because Glenn Powell was kind of funny. Now there is a little problem because the next film, Family Affair, fits exactly all the same mistakes. You could swap the titles and the criticism would match exactly. The only peculiar addition to this film is that everybody is so Botoxed and so stiff that they just stare at each other without basically any variation of emotion throughout the whole plot. Actually, you know what? This film actually feels like a mix of Irish Wish and The Idea of You with Anne Hathaway, because the premise is that a young woman works as the personal assistant to a movie star. One day the star meets her mother and they start a relationship, of course creating cracks in the family. Does that sound familiar? And that's about it. The story doesn't offer much more. Joey King plays the overworked assistant, Zac Efron is the spoiled actor, in the only role that maybe hints at some self-ironic humour, and Nicole Kidman is the MILF he falls for. Of course, the most predictable trope is Nicole Kidman not feeling confident, not feeling sexy, while she's walking around looking absolutely stunning with her hair perfectly done and makeup perfectly done and designer clothes even when she's doing house chores. Of course, Zac Efron's character makes her feel young and beautiful again until everything inevitably gets messy, and there's nothing really more to add beyond what I've already said about The Idea of You and Irish Wish. It's the same shallow, predictable mess with the bonus of the Botox faces awkwardly staring at one another. But next up is The Crow, starring Bill Skarsgård as Eric Draven in what turned out to be an absolutely awful and unnecessary reboot. I'm a huge fan of the original Crow movie from the 90s, which beautifully depicted the power of love and grief against a gritty, dark, rainy, dirty city backdrop, accompanied by an incredible soundtrack. So when the reboot was announced, I was excited, I'll admit that, also because I'm quite a big fan of Bill Skarsgård's work. Then the first images dropped, and my excitement dropped. Everybody looked like they had stepped out of a trap music video. But regardless of that, I thought, you know what? Times have changed. I tried to keep my hopes high, and when the trailer was released, I thought, okay, I guess they've given it a more of a full-on action approach. I tried to go and watch the film, open-minded, but unfortunately, even if you try to watch this film, ignoring any connection to the first film, if you just watch it out of context, it's still awful. awful. The core premise of The Crow relies on the audience believing in the deep, profound love between the protagonists. Their love, when shattered by the villain's attack and murder, drives Eric's resurrection and eventual rampage. But in this version, the love story is so unconvincing that all of the rest of the movie just doesn't work. Instead of building a solid character arc, the couple is just portrayed as rich, spoiled junkies who meet in rehab and spend their days doing drugs and having sex. All very hot and aesthetically pleasing, but that's not what builds characters for me. And why are we having blatant product placement in the scenes in which we should be crying our eyes out for the characters? By the way, what I just said about product placement reminded me of something I wanted to mention. I recently watched We Live in Time, starring Florence Pugh as a woman who is diagnosed with cancer, and she goes through all this journey with her husband, Andrew Garfield. It's supposed to be absolutely heartbreaking. I didn't particularly like it. But anyway, my point about product placement is that already this film constantly mentions Weetabix and chocolate oranges, and then in one of the movie's saddest scenes, Florence Pugh is told about her diagnosis, everybody's crying, and the doctor just conveniently takes out a box of Celebrations, it's a famous brand of chocolate, and offers it to the characters who, you know, crying and talking about cancer, start choosing their favourite chocolate. Didn't anybody think this scene through? Getting back to The Crow, without believable love and grief, the emotional weight of the story completely falls apart. This added to dialogues which are absolutely ridiculous. They don't sound like they were written for anybody over the age of 13. You know the meme of like, I'm 13 and this is so deep. Perfect for this film. Eric goes out on this vengeful rampage for somebody we don't even care about, but hey, they had fancy clothes on, leaving this remake hollow and devoid of the heart that made the original so impactful. Next up is Lola, a film which is way less famous than other titles on today's list, but its mere existence is problematic enough. I have very strong feelings about this film, and I genuinely need to know what went through the creator's mind. So what was the thought process here? Lola tells the story of a drug-addicted sex worker dealing with a bunch of problems, a strained relationship with her boyfriend dealer, a narcissistic mother, a sister feeling alienated for being trans, and she's struggling to keep her job. In short, her life is a mess. Now, if you've seen my video about the best movies of 2024, I talked about Sean Baker and how he basically dedicated his career to telling stories similar to this one. And while Baker doesn't belong to the communities he portrays, after all, he's a rich Hollywood director, he strives to authentically capture their lives, often casting real people instead of actors, basing stories on his personal experiences and locations, and avoiding poverty porn, ghetto corking, however you want to call it. Now, instead, enter Nicola Peltz Beckham, daughter of a billionaire, not a millionaire, billionaire, that's a lot more, and wife to Brooklyn Beckham. So a person completely removed from the experiences the character of Lola would live. So of course I was skeptical about her directing this film, but I still gave her the benefit of the doubt. After all, Sean Baker, rich director, manages to well portray these stories. And also I noticed in the credits that Bria Vinay from the Florida Project was a consultant on this film. So, you know, I tried to keep my mind open. Big mistake on my behalf. The movie is horrendous, and Nicola Peltz Beckham also cast herself in the lead role. That was just the icing on the cake. Why did she have to do that? The movie is packed with ridiculous stereotypes, including over-the-top drug addict scenes, which reminds me of don't do drugs school PSAs. There's a scene of her running to the bathroom to do coke off the toilet seat, but obviously she's all perfectly dolled up and made up, looking like someone who has had the most expensive cosmetic surgery with a face that has clearly seen an error one. Throughout the whole film, as the most horrific things happen, obviously with abysmal delivery and acting, she simply glides around with a sultry expression while everything is drenched in pink filters, fading effects and settings. It looks like they were out of a 2014 Tumblr coquette aesthetic. It's as if this movie's aim was to mimic a Lana Del Rey music video. So of course, when the most tragic, horrible things happen into the characters' stories, you don't feel anything about them because it's obviously just so staged and absurd. If you're looking for a film that tackles these themes with sincerity and depth, just go watch Sean Baker's Anora instead. But now we're on the podium. Are you excited to see what the top 3 are? What could be worse? At number 3, we have Uglies, a film that might have done better numbers if it had been released 10-15 years ago at the height of the teen and dystopian survival movie hype. But to be honest, it's so bad that perhaps even then it wouldn't have found its audience. Uglies is set in a world where beauty standards are absurdly high and teenagers at age 16 undergo intensive cosmetic surgery to, let's say, fix themselves and gain societal acceptance. Those who refuse remain outcasts. To be fair, the premise is interesting, especially in the current time, social media and filters and beauty trends, but the delivery of this film was atrocious. The problems start right from the opening sequence, in which it is dramatically stated, and they were called the Uglies, and then switch right to Joey King examining her perfect flawless skin, standing in front of the mirror with this perfect body. Now I get it that in this film beauty standards are ridiculously high, and even people who are conventionally beautiful for our standards there are considered ugly, but you find it really hard to connect with these characters when they're going about this plight of being so ugly, when everybody literally looks like they just stepped off a modelling set, while they're being so brave for refusing to take the surgery. You know what I mean? And all of that being said, the cosmetic surgery results in this film anyway look like a filter that maybe your aunt would use for a selfie on Facebook. That's how unrealistic it is. All of this glued together by dialogues which feel like they were written by Hollywood's new favourite writer, ChatGPT. Honestly, if you're looking for a meaningful 2024 movie about feeling outcast and undergoing extensive medical surgery because of this, check out A Different Man instead. Getting back to Uglies, while teen dystopian films like The Hunger Games or Maze Runner didn't rely on particularly realistic settings, they at least had a level of grit or depth that helped connect audiences to the characters. In Ugly, in addition to none of this, the world feels over-polished and artificial with some of the worst CGI imaginable. At one point, the characters visit a skate park which literally looks like something out of Spy Kids from 20 years ago. It's baffling to me how these films still get greenlit. At number 2 instead, we have Jenna Ortega, Martin Freeman's bizarre performance in Miller's Girl. The closest comparison I can think of off the top of my head is Saltburn, with these lavish mansions, wild parties and overly polished dialogues, but to be fair, at least Saltburn dared to push boundaries and had a semblance of plot. Miller's Girl is totally hollow, and it literally feels like a fan fiction or something that could have come out of Tumblr from at least 10 years ago. The story centres on the relationship that develops between a teacher and his student, who is portrayed as precociously mature and clever. She charms him with her poetic one-liners, witty essays, and her overly styled, completely unrealistic outfits. Again, if you've seen my video about the best films of 2024, you will have heard my rant about how nobody seems to know what teenagers wear and how they talk anymore. The relationship in this film then escalates out of school, and I'll leave the rest for you to discover. But while the premise had the potential to be deeply uncomfortable and thought-provoking, similar to the way May December handled an age gap relationship, it just utterly fails. Instead, we get scenes so absurdly unrealistic they feel taken from bad fanfiction, like Jenna Ortega staring broodily from a balcony, slow walking in the rain wearing gala dresses, and having supposedly serious conversations about her situation with her best friend in this huge mansion, obviously owned by her conveniently always absent parents. Her best friend anyway doesn't seem to care, and she's fulfilling this Lana Del Rey fantasy, and that's twice that I've quoted Lana Del Rey in this video. Jenna Ortega delivers everything with that same deadpan expression, which worked fine for Wednesday Addams but doesn't work here, and Martin Freeman, in my opinion, just looks like he just forgot that he's usually a good actor. This film was supposed to make us feel uncomfortable or conflicted, but instead it's pure, hollow, unrealistic, I don't know, fan fiction of something that there's not something to be a fan of. I don't know. I can't believe I'm saying this, but if you're craving this sort of vibe, go watch Saltburn instead. At least it tries. But at number 1, the film I think we can all agree is the worst of the year, even given the massive studios behind it and its $80 million budget, is Madam Web. Before watching it, I expected it to be bad, but not this bad. The film is the origin story of Cassie Webb, Madam Web, and a group of girls who will eventually become Spider Women. Like most superhero films, it's packed with lengthy fight sequences, creepy villains. That's all fine. The premise is okay. The delivery was embarrassing. Starting with the fact that it's filmed in a style reminiscent of Shane Dawson's video from 2009, zooming in and out on people talking, freezing on awkward expressions like it's an episode of The Office. Then the dialogues are ridiculous. You've probably heard of that embarrassing forced exposition line of,
"He was in the Amazon with my mom when she was researching spiders right before she died."
But honestly, I can't think of one good serious line from this movie. At least Morbius had the Spartans scene which also had some sort of something to laugh about. And a major part of this movie revolves around Cassie trying to be a mentor to the girls and keeping them safe, but she's so awkward. It all would have been better if they had leaned into a sort of self-aware, ironic tone, which would have made these lines and deliveries feel more fitting. But when you're trying to force it into a serious, heavy superhero vibe, but with deadpan, boring, emotionless performance, it just doesn't work. At one point, I started wondering if the exaggerated, and this is an understatement, editing was put there to compensate for the absolute lack of emotion in this film. Oh, and when in doubt, make sure Pepsi's on the screen. Even in the promotion for this film, the behind the scenes and the interviews, the actors felt as if they were being held hostage while they were doing their lines. I don't think there's one single person interested in seeing more of these characters or the future of the Spider-Women. Maybe they thought we'd be so curious that we'd want separate movies or sagas for each one of them. And that is the end of the top 10, or let's say bottom 10 of the year. Other honourable mentions that didn't quite make it into this list are It Ends With Us, but mostly because of how badly they carried out this movie's marketing. It's a dark film about domestic abuse, but they made people bring their florals to the movie and marketed it nearly as this sort of rom-com project and had Ryan Reynolds using his comedic vibe to market it. Then everybody was excited about The Watchers, as it was directed by Shyamalan's daughter, but it ended up as that meme of Go Girl, Give Us Nothing. Another Go Girl, Give Us Nothing movie with Zoe Kravitz's directorial debut, Blink Twice, which was supposed to be a clever psychological horror thriller about people stuck on a fancy island where things happen to them. Instead, it was a mashup of predictable scenes and literally anything that has ever been done before. I mentioned at the beginning of the video Under Paris, the movie about sharks attacking Olympians through the sewers and river, and that's all you have to know about this film. There were high expectations for Don't Move, as it was produced by Sam Raimi, but ended up being jam-packed with plot holes and a killer spending time talking about his evil master plan while the victim gets away. The first movie about the platform was good, so we were all curious about the platform too, but I think we all walked away confused by all the changes in the lore and the plot holes and the setup for a third film, which I doubt many will be curious about. I watched a new Garfield movie on my 15-hour flight back from Japan, and I was already so blurry from exhaustion, and then the film opened with a Tinder ad. Anyway, I am now curious to know what you hated more in 2024, so let me know with a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and of course don't miss my way more positive video about the best movies of 2024. I hope you enjoyed this video and that 2025 will bring us many more good films. See you soon in the next one. Bye.